Hello, welcome to Together Talks podcast. I'm Alan Miller, and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Molly Kingsley and Liz Cole. Molly and Liz are two of the founders of UsforThem and have recently just completed a really fantastic book called The Children's Inquiry, which is out with Pinter and Martin very shortly. Welcome to Together Talks podcast, guys.
Thanks, Alan.
You know, just to start off, do you want to just explain a little bit how UsforThem came about and what happened in 2020, just in your own words?
Sure. So we met, it was May 2020, and we are both parents. We've both got two kids. And we met on Twitter. We were really born, or UsforThem was born out of a concern that children weren't being, we say prioritised, but honestly, they weren't being considered at all in, what was then the very sort of nascent pandemic response. So we were about 6 weeks into school closures. There was talk of schools maybe going back, maybe not going back. But if they were going back, kids were going to be subject to these, what to us looked like quite damaging, actually, social distancing requirements. And obviously school closures, were still in full swing. And I wrote a blog post about it, stuck it up on my blog. It got retweeted by a journalist, and I met Liz in the comments to the retweet.
And then, we've still got the direct message that we sent on that day, never realising what would transpire from there. So separately to Molly, I'd been having concerns and the same worries, and also our third co-founder, Christine Brett, as well. And we came together from that moment, and we didn't quite understand, did we, how much we were sort of putting our heads above the parapet. And because we were so surprised that children just weren't being, as Molly said, it was not just they weren't being prioritised, but actually there was no discourse about the situation and the impact on children of school closures. And so we thought, well, if nobody else is saying anything, then we will have to say something.
Right, and it was Alison Pearson from The Telegraph, right, that also retweeted you or posted that. And I suppose the question is, now it can seem like a long time ago. So much has happened. But, the whole experience of lockdowns, everyone used the word unprecedented, but lockdowns had never been done before. But particularly with children. And in your book, you go at great length. You show lots of references and examples about even warnings at the start about what this sort of thing would mean. Just, to start at the top, why do you think it is? I'm not sure you've got an answer. This is a tricky question, but why do you think it is that even with warning signs, the government went ahead with the closure of schools?
So, I think there's a bit to unpick there, I think. So I think one of the issues that we've seen time and time again is that a lot of these measures, so school closures is one, and it's in some ways it is the most indiscriminate and potentially the most damaging, but it is just one of many damaging measures. And I think what we've seen time and time again is parents and other people actually who are concerned with the welfare of children saying this is a disaster from a child welfare point of view. It's wrong. We can't do this. And the views of those parents being sidelined or just outright ignored in favour of this adherence to a very narrow scientific, credentialism. So I think, parental instinct was dismissed.
Yeah. And I think the other part of that actually is this sense that, we were weighing up, supposedly weighing up harms and benefits of actions, but children never really featured in that. I think there was a real myopia about, what the outcomes were that we were trying to prevent. And I, as we could see from the documents that we describe in the book, the outcomes were predicted. But I think, we say in the book, there was a sense of almost, that this was something that had to happen. that children, that schools had to close. But actually, as we discuss in the book, there was the evidence for that was very scant. So I think there was almost as they were caught up in a response that was ultimately so catastrophic.
And it's not as though there weren't warnings even in the public domain, were there? Because you cite, for instance, Alistair Munro and Saul Faust, the paediatric researchers, are saying children are not super spreaders and it's time to go back to school, which was in April 2020, as you say in the book. And there were others alongside yourselves who are making these points. And you also do a really great job further in the book, and I won't do any spoilers, but just to sort of give some examples where there were tucked away warnings about what might happen, even in the own kind of discussions that they were having within the government. Is it just that you think that that once they started going in a certain direction, they just couldn't stop? Or what do you think happened? Because it wasn't that it was an ongoing series of things that happened in relationship to children and young people, right? It wasn't just one thing.
I mean, I think what we've discovered is that a structural weakness in our legislative and policymaking framework when it comes to kids, there's a blind spot. We call it a fault line, I think, at some point. And there was this fault line that opened and kids just fell through it. And I think it's a combination of things. It is a structural problem. And I think there's different levels of it. But I think one issue is that children, to put it bluntly, aren't unionised. So obviously on the one, you've got government, you've got very heavily unionised teaching unions, predominantly in this case, have a very strong, powerful voice. They control the workforce. And children, for much of the 2-year period, have ended up being, whether deliberately or inadvertently, they've been the victims of that politicking, actually.
They weren't seen as a priority. That's the bottom line. That the harms to children weren't seen as significant as other harms that were going to arise from the pandemic itself. But actually, as we discuss at length in the book, some of the harms that have come to children through this are extremely serious. Some of them will be carried as a lifelong issue. And unfortunately, some children have lost their lives as a result. So I think it was a disaster that they failed to understand that there were other harms, and some of these harms were going to fall to children who were also extremely vulnerable members of society who needed to be protected, and they weren't.
In terms of assessing and evaluating things, obviously if something new comes along, it can be very daunting and in terms of what to be done. But the risks versus the benefits, so kind of like a cost-benefit analysis, that assessment and evaluation of things. I mean, we will come on to some of the things in the future because you finish up in the book on that. But just in terms of evaluating things, do you think that some of the things that you discuss in the book, the fact that it was recognised it was low risk at schools, that, the community spread was low, that type of thing. Do you think those things have been learned and understood in terms of anything happening in the future?
I don't think it's been learned, actually, because I think what we've now done is we've established, whereas in previous disaster planning, school closures weren't really on the table, we've now established school closures, not once but twice, as an acceptable policy lever, that actually a school was the same as a mass gathering, which it clearly isn't. And it's there as a lever now. It's a mechanism to bring down R. Well, that's not what school is. And I think until we have a recognition that school is a special place in our community and in our society, and that it's ring-fenced, as we call for in the book, as essential infrastructure, then I think that there's a danger of that this could happen again, because schools have now been school and education is now seen as a discretionary benefit that's kind of doled out to kids, rather than something that's their right.
And I mean, actually, the precedent we set, it's terrible. And it's, we're now talking about September school strikes, where schools would switch to remote learning again. And we've let this, I think it's a dishonest fallacy take root, actually, that remote learning can substitute school, and it might not be as good, but it's okay. And I think we would say it's not okay. It is not a substitute for school, and it should never be used as a substitute for school.
And you make the point that in Europe, I mean, it was the second worst situation, I think, in Britain, in terms of the amount of days missed and time. And you add up all the times in there and you look at it. It's a very shocking set of statistics. That point about it's not just the education, although the education is very important, of course, but it's all the other things that go with it in the context of socialization and welfare and well-being and families. If you just when people are talking about these things, I mean, do you want to give us a couple of examples of some of the things that are really shocked you over the period? That, I mean, you talk about quite a lot in the book, but one of the things that you'd say really, if you were to say to someone, this is one of the key things that the consequences of shutting a school down and treating children in this way, what that means, what would you say would it be?
I think some of the outcomes that we've seen, and it almost becomes desensitizing to talk about the data because it's so vast and so sort of all-encompassing. But some of the data that we've seen on mental health, that, eating disorder referrals have tripled, also the impacts on physical health to children, the rise in obesity, all of those things. And then obviously the safeguarding consequences as well, which were completely foreseen. So I think the scope of that, I mean, to be honest, almost everything still shocks me because I don't think there's a recognition of how severe the impacts are at the most senior levels of policy making.
And I think the other thing to remember is it wasn't just school closures. So it was school closures combined with other mitigations and restrictions. So we had a ban on outdoor sport or any sport. We had, particularly in relation to the safeguarding regime, we had schools, which are an essential safeguard for many vulnerable children. We had schools closed, but at the same time, we had all social work go to online. And, we've seen with a few very high-profile tragic cases of the consequences of that. But I think the shocking thing in part for us that as Liz said, it was not only it was predictable, it was predicted. It was written in black and white as early as April 2020 and put in front of, meeting rooms of SAGE members. So something has gone very wrong when that kind of warning has not been looked at or heeded.
Why do you think that was not looked at or heeded?
I mean, look, we weren't in the room, so I don't, it's not clear. We've seen the minutes of the meetings. It's not clear it was looked at. So there was an annex to a paper warning of some of these things, including that vulnerable children were very exposed and that 94% of them were not in school. Do you remember originally when schools were closed, government had allowed for vulnerable kids to be in school and, maybe naively had assumed far more than that would be. And that regime failed. So that was known. It's not clear that was ever discussed. And I think it goes back to the point that, kids just weren't a consideration in thinking. It was this myopic focus on a virus and control of a virus. And
you also reference quotes that saying that even when the vulnerable ones are recognised, there are those that are vulnerable that are not recognised within it, and the complications there. I mean, we did see differences in different countries, though, didn't we? Because, I mean, Sweden was an outlier, but that was an example, I think, where if you did test positive, and we'll come on to testing as well, but if you did test positive, then the one child would go home rather than the bulk. I mean, you give examples of where sometimes a child had been sent home 6 times and they'd never once had COVID, but we had these, but when there was sending whole closing things down. That's another thing, isn't it? There were different ways. I mean, Florida also kept kids in school for the most part. From a policy point of view, do you have any thoughts on why things just continued and there wasn't a kind of referencing back on things?
I think it's kind of a sunk cost, fallacy. Once you've proceeded down a certain route, then you continue. But again, as we explore in the book, I think where something wasn't evaluated in the beginning, so you didn't have a strong evidence base for having brought it in, then it's incredibly difficult to build an off-ramp to stop that, which is one of the things we saw with the testing, that we didn't really know what the outcomes were supposed to be, or how this was going to help keep children in school. In fact, it was missold, really, because all we could see was it putting children out of school. But actually, there was no evidence for that, so they couldn't then get themselves out of it, I think.
And I think at a very fundamental level, it actually speaks to a lack of leadership and a lack of courage. So, you mentioned other countries, and actually it was astounding to us that we followed in this very sheep-like way many other countries into catastrophic decisions. And it's really interesting, actually, because, one of is it Sweden or Denmark? It's Denmark, I think, who have just come out and said that they wouldn't vaccinate children again on, different issue. But, there was a very interesting acknowledgement, I think. And of course, it shows that actually you should make decisions based on their merits, not because other countries have done it. And that was lacking, I think, for many of these decisions.
Again, just to come back to the testing, so it's this lack of urgency. So again, we cast our minds back to this awful summer when hundreds of thousands of children each week were being sent out of school because somebody in their bubble had tested positive. And the government said they would lift that restriction. I think it was on the 19th of July when other restrictions lifted. But that was the end of term. So actually, there could have been a sense of urgency to bring that policy decision forward, because that would have made a huge difference to so many children. It was almost... This was an emergency, that every day that children were not in school and not having access to these interactions, it was urgent, yet there was no recognition of that urgency. So that for me was one of the low points, I think, when, at that point there were events, which obviously were great, social events, sporting events for adults, but still hundreds of thousands of children were effectively not just out of school, but were in isolation when they couldn't even leave the house for 2 weeks at a time. It's just extraordinary behaviour from decision makers to treat children, as we say, like an underclass.
I mean, what's striking reading the book, we've all just been through it, and, you were very, very centrally involved in it, and it was something that was at the forefront of my mind, and I was involved in a lot of things as well. And it is just shocking still to see it all written down in black and white, what happened and as it unfolds. And I suppose the question is, you mentioned, it was not just the closure of schools, it was in the context of lockdowns generally and restrictions in parks and playgrounds and all of those things, those bizarre moments where the police were moving people on for sitting on their own in the park. But in the context of where we know that most transmissions occurred and the most vulnerable section of society, the elderly in the care homes and the hospitals. And we know, and that was known fairly early on, and yet some was, and it wasn't just that it was the government decision. There were, people that were arguing that, almost like this vector idea that children were a place where this would be spread and you would kill elderly relatives and everything. It was quite gratuitous in the way it was presented, and it was quite, just how much do you think now we've come through this? There's an opportunity to reflect back on that, to clarify what happened, and to get people to really understand that from the point of view of, we've obviously gone through it and the damage has been done, but it's in not repeating the same mistakes.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we hope to achieve with the book, is to actually put this account out on the public record. And ask for policymakers to acknowledge the realities, which were that children were not the vectors of the sort of public imagination at all. They were treated unfairly, they were discriminated against, and that we need to think about this for the future of what actually did go wrong here, because it was a disproportionate focus on children. As you say, Alan, that we knew where the risks were, and yet all of the controversy and the focus on mitigations always seemed to be around schools and children, which were a lower risk setting. So yeah, it's baffling really how this happened, and I think it reflects a kind of existing, as we say in the book, an existing sort of disregard for young people and their experiences as well.
I think also there was an ethical conversation that needed to be had that still hasn't been had. And maybe I'm a bit more pessimistic about this because I don't hear this conversation. And for me, actually, even if children had been vectors of this virus, I think you have to ask the question, is it right to treat children like that? And actually, I think what we did was abhorrent, actually. It was disgusting. A society should not treat its children like this. A society should protect its children. And we did the opposite of that. And I think, you also have to ask, looking back to the ethical side of it, is a public health response that impedes an entire generation of otherwise healthy, fit, young people, does it have anything to do with public health? Because I think for us, it's the antithesis of public health.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point about the, if what's frightening about this is children have been treated in this appalling way and had all these harms, health harms that have been distributed onto them. We say it's an intergenerational transfer of harms for a disease that they weren't implicated in more than anybody else. But it's actually horrifying to think if they had been super spreaders, what would the treatment have been then? It's shocking, isn't it? Because actually, as Molly says, we do have a responsibility towards young people.
So there's a few things to come out of that. I'd like to address each of them. But I mean, when you start weighing up, if you were to do assessments and evaluations, the benefit of having closed something, if there was any benefit from that, if in terms of spreading or anything, versus all the costs to loss of school, day lives, loss of education, mental health, all the things that you've listed in the book in terms of the relationships to families, development, the social relations, all of those things that happen in the context of schooling. But also, as you reference, other vaccinations have been missed. The JCVI appointed due to the policies of not actually seeing people at the time and what went along with that as well. So there's a number of other consequential impacts and damages and harms right the way up and down the line, aren't there, that have come across us. In terms of adults protecting children, which has historically been the role of adults in society, I can't think of many societies where they've not done that. And you talked about the intergenerational thing. And we've had like kind of discussion about intergenerational wars in the past and about, people not really respecting older people. And I mean, I got to say that I said to my son who missed so much school that he knew what a dereliction of duty meant too young in his life, really, because I kind of kept saying to him, where the adults have abandoned their positions, because I didn't know how to sort of say, you've got to go and show up. You've got to do this. You've got, in the way that you would want to sort of imbue your child with the values of society, right, and showing up and discipline. When adults seem to have jettisoned that, and so my question is, why do you think they did that? And it's linked to this. Do you think is that the adults, teachers, and others just got so scared that they thought they were all going to die, and they really believed that, or why do you think this came about? That they just went, right, well, we're just not going to go and be there, and we can't have it, it's too dangerous. What was going on?
So I think you've got to put it in the context of what happened in 2020, and I think what the government did, and obviously Laura Dodsworth has written extensively about this in The State of Fear, but what the government did was terrorise its population, and it did it very, very well. And actually, I think, I don't think there should be judgment, actually. I think adults did abdicate their responsibility, but I think the most important thing now is how to move beyond that and actually not blame. So I think it's obviously a very complex societal thing, but I don't think we should deny it happened, because it obviously did. And I think ultimately, I would say people are scared, and people are, all of us collectively were sheep. We don't like standing up. We don't like speaking out. And it became very, very hard to speak out. Poisonous, actually. And we've been on the receiving end of it for 2 years now. And I do understand why it was very difficult. We have had actually a lot of teachers and a lot of people in direct positions of, with the duty of care for children saying how worried they were. With a safeguarding expert, didn't we? Reach out very early on saying, she said, as far as I can see, every adult in the room seems to have forgotten they have a duty to these children.
And I think the fear is a huge part of it, but I also think it was a lack of honesty. from the government about the actual risk stratification of the disease. And they did that deliberately as part of this sort of tactic and related to the fear. But actually, it was clear from the outset what the risk stratification was. And there was opacity about that in order to sort of manipulate people. So I think that really didn't help in terms of getting children moved up the agenda and having adults sort of become paralysed by fear, I think.
Well, I'm going to ask you a difficult question now, just because the question that comes from that is why. And I've heard all sorts of things, and often I'm in all sorts of heated debates with people who think there is this thing and that plan and this plan, and sometimes it seems there's not enough plans to me. But but why? Why? If why do you think this is this a what? It's a difficult question, right? Because obviously you're chronicling what has happened, but the question does get begged. You do sort of think, why is no one just saying, well, actually, we've just made them, this is completely wrong, or now we've understood this? And is it just courage? Is it honesty? Is it what or is it, what's your take from what happened?
In terms of why people aren't sort of accepting that what's happened has been the wrong call.
Well, also we talked a bit about it before, but in what you've just described, why it would be that no one would just say, well, actually, we now need to correct course.
I think once you've gone down a course of action, and this is well documented, it's cognitive dissonance, isn't it? And it's also this idea that you may have made a mistake, and the worst thing you can do is actually admit that mistake. It's far more comfortable to actually think, well, and this is what we see, oh, well, these harms to children are terrible, but it was inevitable and it was a consequence of the pandemic and not of our response, because admitting otherwise would be to admit something so horrific that actually as a collective, as adults, we've harmed children. We can't, it's just something too difficult to confront and look in the mirror and think, actually, this happened and we did this.
But Nadim Zahawi has actually admitted that it was a mistake, right? So, I mean, that certainly is a significant thing, is it not? Is that...
I mean, I would like to think so, but I think it would be far more significant if he now did what was necessary to ensure that mistake can't be made again. Otherwise, it's meaningless, isn't it? It's words. Children have had too many words. They actually need action.
Yeah, and also that does it does kind of stick a little bit for me, because it was a mistake, but it was documented that it was going to be a mistake, and that's exactly why it was never part of the previous planning. That's why. So it's almost as if, oh, it's a real surprise that this has happened and this was a mistake, but it was known that it was going to be a mistake. So that was actually a decision that was made. And I think that's what isn't going to be acknowledged, that it was a decision and a trade-off was made, and the people who were not the winners of that trade-off were kids. Yeah.
I mean, we should know as well, whilst you've been talking about Britain and the UK, obviously it was international, and you cite some very shocking statistics about the consequences globally and internationally, particularly in certain places. Like a couple of examples I pulled from the book is in Ethiopia, primary school children are estimated to have learned only 30 to 40% of the maths they would have done in a normal year. And in Brazil, it was estimated that school closures wiped out a decade of educational progress. Then on top of that, Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, the professor from Stanford, says he believes school closures to be the single biggest generator of inequality that he's seen from a single policy in his lifetime. And then you go on to quote other people like Mark Warhouse from SAGE and others, all who reiterate and underline this. I think that for me, it seems like, perhaps in the same way that Laura Dodsworth's book, A State of Fear, that you mentioned, that really got the public, a section of the public at least, and policymakers and MPs and others. People think MPs understand all the things that are going on, right? And then you suddenly realise they go, oh, there's a nudge unit. I didn't realise that. The behavioural insights team. In a similar way, and so that had a big impact as a kind of reference point for fear and what was done with psychologists. And it seems to me that, with your book, it can perform the same role. I think you've done something here that can, like, when you, as I say, when you put it down in black and white and you've got these references and these points, it really becomes a resounding evidential document in terms of how we sort of work with people, how we deal with things in the future. I mean, we'll come on to this a bit more, but how do you, what do you think about that? I mean, obviously, what do you think about that?
Well, that's what we hope the book will do, because what we've noticed is this real desire from people to move on. And it's understandable because people want to move on with their lives, but actually many children can't move on. And what we don't want is for this whole, disastrous affair to be sort of brushed under the carpet. Not acknowledged, not have the mistakes not acknowledged, but even worse, by not acknowledging those mistakes, we're not putting in a plan for children to help them to recover. So that's one of the sort of key things that we hope to achieve with the book, because we're saying, no, we don't brush this under the carpet. We're not rewriting history. This happened, and now we need to look at this, confront it, accept what's happened, and then find ways creatively to move forward, and also, importantly, ring fence children's lives in any future emergency.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, there were so many things in the book as well that when you're looking back and reading, you think, gosh, I mean, you've made the point, Molly, that it's not about judging now and it's about moving forward. But there was a deeply divisive atmosphere, and it was the case that there was a lot of nasty, terrible things said on social media and elsewhere, and also not that leaders should cave into things, but that there was a certain view. They did a U-turn at the start. They weren't necessarily embarking on that line. And in terms of whenever you have in America, the culture wars are so rife that it's difficult to have any conversation without it being through the prism of the culture war, right? So if you have a conversation about education, they start saying, oh, you must like that president, or you must. It's like, no, I'm talking about education. Do you think there is a way of having these conversations that don't get just demarcated into, oh, you're all COVID idiots, or you're all, it's a much more about how can we all work, dare I say it, together?
I hope so. So one of the things actually that we felt really pleased about with the book is we asked a range of contributors to contribute to it, and, cross-sector, I think, and cross-discipline. And the vast majority said yes. And that was a really lovely, we've got a couple of the sort of union leaders in, we've got obviously educators, we've got politicians, and actually seeing that mix of people come together for children has given hope, I think, that actually maybe we can move beyond this. And I think, the harm we've done to kids is seeping into public consciousness, I think. I agree that no one is really taking responsibility or wanting to own the decisions that led to it. But I think whereas a year ago we were often rebuffed with this idea, oh, kids are resilient, stop catastrophizing. We heard that all the time. Well, no one says that really anymore, do they? And I think that's a start, because I think once people acknowledge the harm, you can then have a conversation about actually, well, what does it look like to fix it? I
do think we should talk about the unions a bit, though, in the public sector, because the question of protection of members in the union is an important question always, right? I think that's what unions are there to do. But the context of that, it isn't just necessarily always objective. It is striking that I wonder why you think, let's put it that way, why do you think it is that, in particular the NEU, its relationship to schools, and now the question is striking again, potentially, why do you think it is that you've mentioned the fear and the concern, a danger, but it was also, the term political football was used in the book as well, and how children were placed there. Do you think it was seen in an instrumental way as well to sort of win some political points, or, what do you think was going on there?
I think this happened in the context of a history of tension and bitterness, honestly, and children became caught in the crossfire of that. I think this was an established conflict, I think, the unions, as you say, their role is to protect their members and their members' interests. I think at some points in that, there's a wider sort of political conflict in play. And, to the point that in the book we mentioned that at one point the Children's Commissioner had told the unions and the government to stop squabbling. So they were behaving like children when actually they should have been behaving like the adults in the room, and putting children first. But I think one of the things that was the most detrimental actually at the beginning was the way that the discourse around schools was framed only in terms of safety, of workplace safety, and I think that was a very legitimate position, obviously for a union to take. But there was no counterweight at the outset that was also looking at school closures in terms of children's welfare, and I think that balance was never really readdressed, and I think that was very damaging indeed.
And I think actually as a campaign, we, right at the beginning, I remember, the three of us saying, there needs to be the parent voice, whether it's ours, other organisations, it doesn't matter. It needs a voice of someone representing kids in that room. And actually subsequently, we have wondered why the Children's Commissioner wasn't in the room, because that would have been the obvious person. But actually over the last few years, I think we've, as a body representing children, some children, we've had to be quite inventive, I think, about how to create leverage and, sort of almost elbowing our way into the kind of discussion, because actually children don't have leverage and they're not unionised, and there's no workforce to barter with, if you're looking at it like that, in the same way that a teaching union would have.
Well, it's quite an inspiring story on your part, though, because when I first heard about you, it was actually a woman making a contribution at an event. That I think it was probably a remote event at the time, but talking about you guys and how you'd set up, and I'd heard about it. And, it's a fantastic example of leadership and taking a stand, mothers giving a lead. And actually getting really into the heart of policy and having an impact. And you've had an impact, right, significantly. If you talk about the discussion about masks and mask wearing, particularly in primary schools, and what that meant and everything, it pretty much down to you guys, UsforThem, and your work that you've done, that was turned around, wasn't it? That's the reality of the situation.
It's hard, isn't it? Because you never actually know. I think one of the things we've learned is you never really know what impact you've had. And, there have been a lot of voices, and I would like to think that we had a role. But there are so many people, and, you guys as well, many other people advocating as well. But I think the difference between here and America is notable, actually. And I think if we have quite a lot of American parents reach out to us, actually, and say, how did you do it? Because, of course, their kids there, are they still masked in New York, or has that now ended?
Well, it just recently ended in New York. It's been astonishing what's happened in New York.
It has. It's not how you get to a point as a society where that can happen, I think, is terrifying. So I guess if you judge where we are here against that.
And I think with the mask thing, all we've ever done and all we've ever asked from the very beginning was for things to be based on evidence, that measures and any restrictions, any non-pharmaceutical interventions, as they're called, which sound so benign, but they're really not benign at all, were evidence-based, and that we looked at the harms as well as the benefits. That was the drum that we banged right from the beginning. So with masks, it was no different. And then in the end, after having banged this drum for, a year or so, finally the Department for Education produced its evidence pack, which was been waited for so long, and sure enough, there was no evidence of benefit, within a school setting, which is intuitively would seem sensible, given if anybody who's ever met a teenager would know that they're not going to be wearing masks in any sort of controlled laboratory environment to accrue those benefits. Yet the harms were intuitive again. So I think the way that we approached that issue was really just to ask for the evidence, and of course it didn't appear.
I mean, it is interesting that one of the things that's been indicative of policy of the last 15 years or so, people sometimes say the evidence says this, right? So you must do this. And it's almost like, see, there's no policy interface. But in the context of the last 2 years, some people want to see some evidence, but not all the evidence, right? I mean, there's this mismatch. And often the accusation against people who are raising questions or saying let's not do this particular shutdown or restriction, the accusation is that that's just cavalier and dangerous, and what about the science? But when you want to present the evidence, that's, it's almost like it's fallen on deaf ears a little bit. I wonder why that is. It's a difficult question. I don't know why quite that is. I don't know what you think.
I think people have at this point, I think people perhaps have established their views. And unfortunately, it's, policy-based evidence making, isn't it, throughout, that actually, a certain policy is desired and then the evidence is chosen to back that up. And I think it's what you said earlier. It's about being able to admit that maybe something was the wrong course of action, that as new data comes in, we correct course. But I think so few people are actually able to do that. And I think this has become such a toxic issue that it's ever harder, actually.
We've also had an inversion of the precautionary principle, haven't we? This idea that actually it was precautionary to do something that may or may not help, but, we're not going to look at what harm that doing something might do. And to our mind, it's the opposite of that. It would have been precautionary not to impose many of these measures.
And interestingly, at the moment, there's a discussion in Germany and Ireland and other places. And in fact, in New York, they still have masks on the subway and in museums and on Broadway. But there's a discussion about reintroducing them. And so you think, how much is it just about looking like something must be done, and how much is it about something that is got efficacy? And as you say, particularly in the context of children, where that's really, really essential in terms of development and that type of thing. Obviously, it's important for everyone. This is what the concern is somewhat, that I think you're saying that, once you set precedents and once there's a certain sense that things can be done as part of a policy repertoire, will it just be repeated? I mean, in the broader context, we're in a cost of lockdown crisis, I would say, and as we head towards the autumn, what we've seen in the last decade and a half has always been every winter there's pinch points around, service of the NHS and everything. But I think this year, millions waiting, much more is happening. We've seen, seems ludicrous, but things like monkeypox being presented or virus X or whatever, you can just kind of, or can you see, or am I just now so nervous after the last two? Because, on the third lockdown, I was thinking there's no way we're having a third. I was thinking we're not going to do a third lockdown. That's not possible. And then things like that happen. So I just wonder, in the context of that, where we're going, how much, how do you see that, where we're going now in the next little period? Do you think I'm just being a little bit overly sensitive and nervous? Or
I don't think you're being overly sensitive, because I think, like you, I didn't think that they would close schools again. I just didn't think they would do it, knowing the harm. So I think since these policies have been established, it's always troubling that they could revert. And I think there's this impetus to select the measure which costs the government nothing and has impact at a visual level, that something has been done, which I think is the appeal of masks, because it's something that everybody can see when they go about their business, but it's not something that the government dips its hand into its pocket for. Win-win for them.
I mean, there seems to be no acknowledgement that actually all these measures have a cost, and the cost, as you say, the cost of living is a cost of lockdown crisis. It's a huge cost. But again, we've not really seen an acknowledgement of that. So no, I think nothing should be considered as off the table at this point, because we've not established that principle.
I mean, and we are seeing, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we were told various things. And so this is where the trust gap, there was a trust deficit before all of this. It was significant. I mean, when you ask people about politicians or bankers and others, there was and there are lots of discussions about trust and why that's come about over the last couple of decades. But, we did have a health minister that said this would only be for, like, for instance, the vaccination was for adults, and we know there was particularly high risk groups, and it then 50 million jabs to freedom. Then when it went 6-year-olds, 50-year-olds, and now we're at a point where 6-month-olds are having a procedure, and it does raise questions about even this thing where you can we get into a policy and we carry on doing it, but who is going to stand up and say, well, actually, this is not necessary, we're not going to do it? And, and how do you see, I mean, without getting you on the whole subject, but just what do you think about that in the context, obviously, of children, but also how those things are changed? Because we were told one thing, that it's explicitly absolutely not going to be for people who are not adults, for children. And then here we are in a new moment again.
I mean, look, I think, well, let's be candid. I think the process as regards the vaccination of children in the UK has been incredibly unorthodox, actually. And I think we're now seeing, it won't only be due to this, but we are beginning to see really troubling declines in rates of uptake of genuinely essential vaccination programs. And I think, one of the things we say in the book is that actually this is going to become a public health emergency. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, Alan, because we desperately need trust in childhood immunisation programs to be restored. We've just seen polio vaccination rates are falling. We know measles, how these are really serious, or can be very serious illnesses for children and parents. Before now, you would have, we had very high rates of vaccination, and that was a good thing. And I think it's very hard to restore trust, as you say, when you've got this ongoing situation with a vaccination that perhaps many parents are now, declining to give their kids. And you've got this odd situation where you've got this very ambiguous series of statements from the government's own vaccine advisory panel, those having been to a degree overruled by ministers. And it's very hard to know what to make of that. But it desperately needs, I think, this needs leadership. It needs someone to step in and to give a very clear statement on, why, if it is needed, is the COVID vaccine needed for children, a clear and unambiguous recommendation or non-recommendation, and, the restoration somehow of trust in the other programs. And actually, the diversion of resource. So one of the things that the JCVI were clearly very concerned about in their discussions around the COVID vaccine for kids was the impact in terms of resource. Obviously, the resources are finite, the impact in terms of resourcing on the other vaccination programs. And again, this is what we've seen. The NHS has been so busy vaccinating kids for COVID, actually, you wonder what impact that's had on the other jabs. I
mean, the thing that... reading through your book, you've got so many great references from Arthur Miller and Salem and witch hunts to Greek writing and the Cassandras, which you are clearly. I would really recommend everyone to go and read this book. It's fantastic. It's called The Children's Inquiry, and it's the inquiry that we should be having in society. And we know that the COVID inquiry is 25, 26 and now hasn't even started and is a year delayed. It's got 60 barristers, but who knows when it's going to come, and didn't even have the word child or children in it till you guys really made a very big stink about it, quite rightly, and got some press and attention. So well done, you guys, and well done for being consistent voices to shine a light on this situation for children and for everyone in society. I think you've been remarkable leaders in this. You've done a really incredible job, and I'd encourage everyone to get the book, The Children's Inquiry, and good luck with it all. And perhaps we can down the road come back and have another talk, and we can see how much of an impact it's had and where we're going, and hopefully we'll never have to have a situation like this again. So Molly Kingsley, Liz Cole, UsforThem, thank you very much. This is the Together Talks podcast.